Most people don't think of hiking in England as particularly dangerous. That was certainly my attitude. The trails here usually feel pretty safe. You're never that far from a village, a farm, or another walking path. I'm 28, I live in Manchester, working as a digital marketer. I sit at a desk all day staring at screens, so every autumn I take a week of leave to go walking. 2 years ago, I decided to tackle a long, miserable stretch of the Pennine Way up in the north. I'd chosen late October because I wanted quieter trails. By then, the tourist season was completely dead. The weather was classic northern English rubbish, a constant, heavy sheet of gray drizzle. I was hiking completely alone, wrapped up in my Gore-Tex, slogging through miles of dark, rolling peat bogs and craggy limestone grit. On the third day, the fog rolled in. I'd dealt with fog before, but nothing like this. After a while, I could barely see more than a few yards ahead of me. Around 4 in the afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. The wind had a wicked bite to it. I unzipped my anorak and pulled out my mobile to check the OS map. The battery sat at 12%, but the GPS confirmed I was still roughly 4 miles away from the stone bothy, where I planned to spend the night. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and pushed forward, following the faint muddy track carved into the peat. About an hour later, the path started to vanish. The packed mud faded into thick, dense heather. The painted wooden marker posts I had been relying on disappeared into the white wall of mist. I stopped walking, pulled my phone out again, and tapped the screen to check my bearing. I remember pressing the power button a few more times before it finally sank. In that, it wasn't coming back on. I was officially off the path, stranded in a massive, featureless moor, wrapped in a blinding fog as the sun began to set. That's when I started to panic. Getting lost on the moors in freezing rain is no joke. The exposure alone kills walkers every single year. If I stayed in one spot, hypothermia would set in before midnight. If I kept moving blindly, I could walk right off a limestone edge. I stood totally still, gripping my trekking poles, straining my ears to listen for the distant sound of a motorway or a river. Over the whistling of the wind, I heard a bell. It was a dull, metallic chime. It sounded exactly like the brass bell a farmer straps to the neck of a lead sheep, so the flock can follow them through the mist. I felt a huge sense of relief. Where there are sheep, there's an active grazing field, a dry stone wall, or a farmer's track leading down into a valley. I adjusted my rucksack and began trudging toward the sound. The chime echoed through the thick fog. It was moving slowly, leading me steadily across a ridge of sharp, black limestone rocks. I followed the bell for 20 minutes. My thighs were burning from the effort. The ground beneath my boots began to change, shifting away from solid earth to deep, squelching moss that felt spongy and unstable. The bell sounded incredibly close now. It felt like it was coming from just 20 feet ahead of me, completely hidden behind the wall of white mist. "Hello," I shouted, hoping the shepherd was walking near the animal. "I've lost the path." For a second, I genuinely expected somebody to answer. Instead, the bell stopped ringing. Everything went quiet. No crunching of hooves, no bleating, nothing. I took a slow step forward, pulling a torch from my jacket pocket and clicking the beam on to try and cut through the dense fog. The torch beam cut through the fog and landed on a patch of bare mud a few feet ahead. Sitting in the exact center of the mud was a rusted brass bell attached to a rotting leather collar. There was no sheep, I just stood there staring at it. If a sheep had simply dropped a loose collar, the bell wouldn't have been ringing as it moved steadily across the ridge just seconds prior. I took another cautious step toward the bell to inspect it. As my right boot hit the earth, the ground instantly gave way. It wasn't solid mud. I had walked straight off the firm rock and onto a patch of bog hidden beneath the moss. The layer of floating moss collapsed immediately under my weight, plunging my leg down past my knee into a freezing, thick black sludge. I fell forward with a shout as freezing bog water surged up around my waist. My trekking pole vanished beneath the surface, and my right leg just kept sinking. I tried to pull it free immediately, but it felt like something was holding it in place. I'd read about peat bogs before, but I'd never actually stepped into one. Panic completely took over. I threw my torso backward, sprawling flat across the solid edge of the limestone rocks behind me, pulling frantically at my submerged leg. The heavy sludge refused to let go. I kicked with my left foot against the firm stone, dragging my body backward with every ounce of strength I possessed. After what felt like forever, my leg finally pulled free from the suction. The force ripped my walking boot clean off, leaving it buried somewhere in the bog. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, completely soaked in freezing black muck, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. I lay flat on the safety of the stone ridge and stared at the deadly pool of bog water I had nearly drowned in. Sitting right on the edge of the collapse, directly in front of the sinkhole, was the heavy brass bell. I lay there trying to catch my breath and stared at it. One thing suddenly occurred to me. The bell wasn't attached to anything. There was no sheep, there was no flock. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of it. Even now, I can't completely rule that out, but lying there soaked in freezing mud, I couldn't think of one. I didn't turn my torch beam toward the surrounding fog. I didn't try to look for wet footprints on the moss. I didn't even try to reach into the mud to retrieve my missing boot. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I turned around and started moving as fast as I could, limping in one soaking wet sock. I ran until my lungs burned. I finally hit a crumbling dry stone wall, dragged my freezing body over it, and followed the barrier blindly down into a steep valley where I eventually hit a paved single-lane road. I walked along the tarmac until a passing delivery van spotted me and gave me a lift into the nearest stone village. I sat in the local pub for 3 hours, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket the landlord brought out for me from the back room. I sat near the fire trying to warm up while the barman poured me a whiskey. I told the worried locals I had simply got turned around in the heavy weather and lost my footing near a wet patch of ground. I did hear some of the local stories later on. A few of them involved people hearing things in the fog and ending up somewhere they shouldn't have been. Most people treat those stories as folklore. Maybe that's all they are. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that if I'd followed that bell for another few more steps, I probably wouldn't be here talking about it. I grew up near the Cascade Mountains, which basically means you learn to hike before you learn to drive. The trails out here aren't just dirt paths in a park. They are massive, twisting networks that cut through thick rainforests and sharp mountain drops. If you stick to the main trails, you pass families and tourists every 10 minutes. If you take the deeper trails, you can walk for 2 days without seeing another human being. I work as an accountant for a mid-sized shipping firm. My job is incredibly stressful, packed with tight deadlines and ringing phones. To reset my brain, I usually take a solo weekend hike once a month. 2 years ago in early October, I picked a trail deep in the Cascades that I'd never done before. I packed my bag on a Friday night. I brought a small, one-man tent, a tiny camp stove, a water filter, and enough freeze-dried meals to last 3 days. I also packed my headlamp and a canister of bear spray. I love the woods, but I'm not stupid. I drove out to the trailhead early Saturday morning. The gravel parking lot was completely empty. I checked the weather app right before I lost cell reception. No rain, highs in the 50s, dropping to the low 30s at night, perfect hiking conditions. The first 6 miles were a brutal uphill climb. The trail was narrow, lined on both sides by huge spruce trees and thick, wet ferns. The tree canopy was so dense it blocked out most of the sun, making the forest floor look like it was already dusk. Around 2 in the afternoon, I stopped near a shallow creek to filter some drinking water. I was sitting on a mossy rock, pumping water into my bottle, when I heard a dry branch snap. It didn't come from the trail behind me. It came from the thick, pathless woods right across the creek. I stopped pumping. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the water rushing over the stones. "Hey," I called out, assuming it was just a careless hiker wandering off the trail. No answer. I stared hard into the brush. I didn't see a brightly colored rain jacket. I didn't hear the jingle of hiking poles, just absolute silence. I figured a black bear or an elk had caught my scent and backed off. I capped my water bottle, threw my pack over my shoulders, and kept moving. I hit my planned campsite around 5 o'clock. It was a small, flat dirt clearing near a sharp bend in the trail. Someone had built a primitive fire ring out of river rocks years ago. The temperature dropped fast as the sun went down. I set up my tent, boiled water for my noodles, and ate dinner while watching the shadows get longer across the clearing. By 8 o'clock, it was pitch black. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the mesh door of my tent, and turned my headlamp off to save the battery. I usually fall asleep instantly after a long hike. The physical exhaustion just knocks you out. But I couldn't sleep. For some reason, the silence outside was really getting to me. Around 1 a.m., a sound broke the silence. It was a slow footstep on the dry pine needles. My eyes snapped open. I lay perfectly still in the dark. My first thought was bear, but after a few seconds that didn't feel right. The footsteps were too slow and too deliberate. It sounded like someone moving around my campsite in the dark. Somebody was walking a slow circle around my tent in the dark without a flashlight. My heart immediately started pounding. I reached out in the dark and grabbed the canister of bear spray, slipping my thumb right under the safety tab. I waited for the person to call out. Lost hikers sometimes wander into camps looking for a fire or asking for directions. They didn't say a word. The footsteps just slowly traced the edge of my campsite. I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified the thin nylon fabric of my tent was going to suddenly rip open. The footsteps stopped directly outside the mesh door of my tent. They were less than 2 feet from my head. I held my breath. I could hear the wet sound of air pulling through a guy's nose. The zipper on my rain cover clicked. They were trying to pull the outer flap open. I didn't try to reason with them. I didn't try to play dead. I squeezed the rubber button on my headlamp, flooding the inside of my tent with blinding white light, and screamed at the top of my lungs. "I have a gun, back off." I didn't own a gun, but the threat usually works. The zipper immediately stopped moving. Whoever it was immediately backed away. I heard boots hitting the dirt and then running off through the trees. I sat there holding the bear spray for the rest of the night. Every little sound made me jump. I didn't sleep a single minute. As soon as the light hit the clearing, I unzipped my tent. The campsite wasn't trashed. Nothing was stolen. Part of me wanted proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I found the tracks. They were deep, muddy impressions from boots. They led away from my tent, straight into the thickest part of the brush. I packed my gear in record time. I didn't care about finishing the 20-mile loop. I just wanted to get back to my car. I started the brutal hike back the exact way I came. I kept my head on a swivel, checking the trees every few seconds, terrified the guy was going to jump me on the narrow path. I hit the halfway mark around noon. I reached the shallow creek where I had filtered water the day before. I knelt down by the water to splash some cold water on my face. I looked across the creek. Sitting on top of a massive, flat boulder, right where the sound of the snapping branch had come from yesterday, was a stack of river stones. They were piled up into a tall, careful pyramid. At the very top of the rocks rested a single item. It was my spare hiking sock, the one I had draped over a branch near my tent the night before to dry out. My brain just stopped working. I just stood there staring at it. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't thinking of, but I couldn't come up with one. The only thing that made sense to me was that whoever came into my campsite the night had been watching me long before I went to sleep. And if that was true, it meant the whole thing wasn't random. I didn't stop to filter water. I didn't look back. I practically jogged the remaining 6 miles to the parking lot. My car was exactly where I left it. I threw my pack in the trunk, locked the doors, and drove out of the mountains as fast as the dirt road would allow. I still love hiking, I still appreciate the woods, I still love being out in the woods, but I don't camp alone anymore. Maybe the guy was just messing with me. Maybe he had no intention of actually hurting me. Honestly, I don't care. Whatever his intentions were, he got close enough to unzip my tent in the middle of the night. That's close enough for me. I've shared this story online a few times, and most people think I either imagined parts of it or left something out. Maybe they're right, I don't know. All I can tell you is what happened. It was my first backpacking trip, and it's the reason I still have trouble camping by myself. I am sharing it again because I need to know if anyone else out there has experienced anything even remotely similar. I'm 24. Last year I decided I wanted to get into backpacking. I was a total rookie. I bought all the gear, the tent, the boots, the heavy pack, but I had zero actual survival skills. I'd spent way too much money on gear I barely knew how to use, so once the weekend arrived, I was determined to actually put it to use. To play it safe, I picked a heavily trafficked, easy 3-day trail out in the Appalachian Mountains in Virginia. It was late September and I'd been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The leaves were changing and the air was cool. For the first few miles, it was great. I passed families, guys walking their dogs, people carrying day packs. Around 3 in the afternoon, the crowd thinned out. I was resting on a fallen log, drinking some water, when I heard footsteps coming up the trail behind me. It was another hiker. He looked to be around my age. He was wearing jeans, a bulky red flannel shirt, and carrying a bright blue backpack that looked practically brand new. "Hey man," he called out, waving. He was breathing pretty hard. "Hey," I replied, standing up and adjusting my pack straps. He walked up and stopped next to the log, pulling a plastic water bottle out of his side pocket. He looked totally exhausted. "Whoever rented this trail as moderate was lying," he said, wiping sweat off his forehead. "I'm Jason, first time out here doing an overnight." "I'm Rennie," I told him, instantly relieved. "First time for me too, my calves are screaming." We started walking together. It felt incredibly natural. We bonded over being complete rookies. He told me he worked in IT back in Maryland and just wanted a weekend away from looking at screens. We talked about movies, complained about how heavy our packs were, and traded tips we read on the internet. We hiked for another 3 hours until the sun started to drop. We found a great, flat clearing near a small stream. We decided to set up camp together. There's a psychological safety net when you camp with another person. It makes the dark woods feel a lot less threatening. Jason set his bright orange tent up about 20 feet away from mine. He struggled with the poles for a while, cursing under his breath, until I walked over and helped him snap the rainfly into place. We built a small fire. We sat on the dirt, ate our terrible dehydrated pasta, and shared a chocolate bar he brought in his pack. It was a perfectly normal, mundane camping trip between two guys who just met on the trail. By around 10 o'clock, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. We'd spent most of the evening talking, but eventually the conversation started to slow down. We were both tired, cold, and ready to sleep. "I'm crashing," Jason said, standing up and brushing dirt off his jeans. "I am totally dead. See you in the morning, man." "Yeah, see you," I said as I watched him unzip his bright orange tent, crawl inside, and zip it shut. I heard him shifting around in his sleeping bag. A few minutes later, I crawled into my own tent and went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later. My bladder was painfully full from drinking too much water at dinner. The woods were freezing cold. I pulled my jacket on, grabbed my flashlight, unzipped my tent door, and stepped out into the clearing. I walked past the dead firing toward the trees. I shined my flashlight toward the spot where Jason had set his tent. My stomach gave a hard, sickening drop. The bright orange tent was gone. For a second I thought I was looking at the wrong spot. I blinked hard, aiming the beam of my light directly at the ground where his shelter had been sitting. There was nothing there, just flat, undisturbed dirt and dead leaves. "Jason," I called out softly, assuming maybe he moved his tent because the ground was lumpy. No answer. The woods were completely, totally silent. I walked over to the spot as my heart started pounding against my ribs. I shined my light on the dirt. There were no stakes left behind. There were no impressions in the soil where the heavy backpack had been sitting. I shined the light into the firing. There were no wrappers from the chocolate bar we had shared. There was no second empty packet of dehydrated pasta, just the remains of my own dinner. I stood in the freezing dark, totally alone. I kept trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe he packed up and left, but that didn't make sense either. Packing a tent is noisy. Rolling up a sleeping bag is noisy. I would have heard something. What really bothered me wasn't that he was gone. It was that there wasn't a single sign he'd ever been there. The spot where we'd been setting up his tent looked untouched. The leaves were perfectly flat. I spent the rest of the night locked inside my tent, gripping my pocket knife, absolutely terrified that someone had snuck into our camp, grabbed Jason, and completely erased his setup. When the sun finally came up, I packed my bag in a frantic blur and practically ran the entire 8 miles back to the trailhead. I reached the parking lot. I ran to my car and threw my bag in the trunk. I scanned the lot. I remembered seeing 3 other cars when I parked on Friday morning. Now it was just my car and a rusty truck parked near the exit. I drove straight to the ranger station in the nearest town. I told them I thought something might have happened to a guy I'd met on the trail. We'd camped together the night before, but when I woke up, there was no sign of him or his tent. The ranger asked for Jason's full name. I froze. I realized I didn't know his last name. I didn't know his phone number. The ranger took my statement, drove out to the trailhead, and checked the registration box where hikers sign in. My name was on the sheet. Nobody named Jason had signed the logbook all week. My family thinks the isolation got to my head. My friends think I got dehydrated and hallucinated the entire conversation to cope with the loneliness of my first solo hike. They tell me my brain fabricated a friendly face so I wouldn't panic in the deep woods. People tell me I imagined the whole thing. Maybe that's possible. But if I did, then somehow I imagined helping him put up his tent. Somehow I imagined sitting by the fire talking to him for hours. Somehow I imagined sharing a chocolate bar with him. I don't know how to make sense of that. It's been a little over a year now. Every once in a while, I still search hiking groups and missing person databases, hoping something will click. I've never found anyone who matches him. Maybe there's a simple explanation, and I just haven't figured it out yet. I honestly hope that's the case. Because if there isn't, then I spent an entire afternoon hiking, talking, and sharing a campsite with someone who somehow left no trace that he was ever there.